with myself, Steve Walker, and Bonnie Craven. Welcome, folks. It's been another busy week, hasn't it?
Never any shortage of things to talk about, is it? It's a strange old world at the moment.
It is. Strangest thing, well, it's not so strange, really. I mean, we were kind of watching the slow decline of Labour's fortunes in polling and that trend of the Tories growing an ever bigger lead. And we got to the point where we were looking at an 8-point lead. But now the Tories hold a 13-point lead over Keith's Labour, according to YouGov. Despite an easy media ride and ample amounts of Tory stupidity to oppose if he wanted to, he's literally led Labour to lower polling than we had at the 2019 general election, which saw us plummet, possibly due to in large fact to a certain speech that he might have made regarding Brexit at the time. The man is a raving liability now, and his shadow chancellor doesn't seem to be a great deal better. Annalise Dodds, he always comes across as looking like a rabbit caught in headlights. And like her boss, is just absolutely massively out of her depth. The freezing of the personal allowance came up in the budget this week, which means everybody who earns enough to pay income tax, when their pay's uprated in April, will pay more tax, and that will disproportionately hit the lower end of those earners than the higher end, even though she's gone on TV and said the complete opposite. In fact, the lowest end won't even be the lowest end anymore, because this uprating, once their pay has been uprated, it will push people who are just below the threshold previously just above that threshold now, and will start paying income tax for the first time. These people are not earning a great deal more. It's a pittance, but they're going to get walloped with income tax. It hits the lowest earners hardest, Annalise. You can expect a rise in evictions, and longer food bank queues, and all the other signs of increasing poverty in our country as a result. And combine that with the pay freeze on NHS workers that we've heard about this week, who predominantly already pay income tax and have looked after us during this crisis, saved the Prime Minister's life, let's not forget. They're due to be hit harder than most by this budget. Meanwhile, that hike in corporate profits, which actually does hit the wealthiest, is opposed by these Burks. I mean, the Tories have done it, they look left-wing on economics as a result of this, and they aren't. Because what they've done is to effectively said, yes, we're going to raise corporation tax, but not for 2 years. And in the meantime, we're going to give them a massive tax break and call it a super deduction. They're going to bring their spending forward from about 2 years' time, and they're going to bring it forward and call it investment instead, and get a massive tax break on it. They're going to get £13 back from the government for every £10 they invest. It's a scam. This is a Labour Party leading us to disaster with incompetence, ineptitude, and an insolent refusal to listen to anyone pointing out the obvious. Something's got to change now, surely, guys.
You'd certainly hope that you'd see a Labour Party at the moment hammering the Tories with some of the crap they've been getting up to this week and some of the nonsense in the budget. Total scam on that, and yet we've seen, just this kind of nibbling around the edges that goes on all the time, where they'll pick something and essentially say, well, yeah, but you should do it a bit faster, or you should do it in a slightly different way, but they don't actually go for the meat of the stuff. And there's no shortage of meat to go for in terms of the way that the policies are actually penalising ordinary people and helping the rich, in spite of a headline that it's supposedly taxing wealthy people and companies more. The substance of it isn't there. And the ones who are really getting hit again, as ever, are the low-paid, the vulnerable, the ordinary working people and non-working people who are suffering in the pandemic at the moment. And especially then the NHS, which has been an absolute disgrace. And I have to say that, one of the hot runners on the Squawk Box page this week has been a simple image of a nurse giving 2 fingers to the government. And, I think that says a lot about what people think of the whole thing. Bonnie, what do you make of it?
Well, it's just astounding, isn't it? At a time that we're being led by a Prime Minister who's overseen the death of tens of thousands of people avoidably. At the start of the pandemic, we were told, if we only, in inverted commas, lose 20,000 people to coronavirus, it would be a good result. Well, we've topped that by at least 100,000, and the numbers keep going up. And yet we're seeing no argument from the Labour Party about what needs to be done differently or better. We ought to be flying high in the polls. I mean, I remember in the last sort of 7 years, we were told all the time we should be 20 points ahead of the polls because these Tories are dreadful and they're ripping apart the very fabrics of our society. And they're really going for hell for leather right now, and we're just dropping in the polls. And elections aren't won, elections are lost. And right now, the Tories are looking like they're going to win again. If there was an election next week with that sort of polling number, we would lose even more seats. It's unbelievable.
We would. It's ridiculous. It's perverse, actually, that a government that has been so inept, so corrupt, and so incompetent is flying high in the polls and would, as you say, if a general election was called tomorrow, increase their seats in government because people want to see these things challenged. The opposition is there for a reason, to oppose, to recommend improvements, to put forward alternative ideas if they think they're going to better, and there's none of that. And that's being, people are not fools. They're seeing that this has been the way it's been for 11 months now that Keir Starmer's been leader. And yes, we're talking, brought up the figure of 13 points behind. That is only one poll, but it's the latest poll in a trend. And that trend has been a downwards one for Labour. We've seen, the same poll actually had the Green Party leap up into third place above the Liberal Democrats. You can see where people are taking their voting intention now, and they're going to benefit from it on a numbers scale, but they won't translate into seats. The only way that our awful political election system is going to work out for is going to be for the Tories.
We really do need to remind certain people that opposition means you don't say we agree with the Tories. I mean, we've seen parents worried to death about potentially sending their kids back to school. We've seen probably every family that we know lose a relative to coronavirus. We've seen people get furloughed and have to lose 20% of their income. Often that's they can't afford to lose 20% because of the number of people we've got that are classified as working poor. We've seen the growth of food banks go through the roof. It's just disaster after disaster. And the only people that are benefiting from this regime are the ultra elite, the people that are already billionaires at the cost of everybody else. This should be the end of the government. This should have brought down the government. Their failures in the last year should have brought them down, and it isn't. They've got no shame.
Well, it's telling in the budget this week that the one tax band that Rishi Sunak didn't put a cap on was the one that for people that are earning £150,000 a year or more. And how many people does that apply to? So they don't get capped on their tax allowance. That can keep going up. But anybody on the low rate or no tax at all, or the middle rate of tax, what they call the higher rate, is getting capped for the next 5 years, essentially. I think one of the key things as well, with regard to the pandemic, I mean, we're seeing the schools go back next week. Schools have always been open. Some of them have been reporting 30 to 50% class sizes because the government expanded the people that can qualify as key workers to essentially make it meaningless. But, schools are reopening. The government is trying to claim that it's safe to do that now because of the success of the vaccine, given, we've actually only had still less than 1 million, I think it is, people actually vaccinated, as in 2 doses and properly immunized against, the virus as far as they can at the moment. And lots of people given 1 dose, which is, it's still not quite clear as to how much protection that's going to give people. However, SAGE this week put out comments, the scientists on the SAGE committee expressed their concerns that the reopening of the schools was actually going to undo, and the lifting of the lockdown in general was actually going to undo or possibly counteract some of the effectiveness of the vaccination campaign. So they're making pretty clear that it's not actually the vaccine that's driven down the infection rates at the moment, it's the lockdown that's driven the infection rate at the moment. And the vaccine program hasn't gone far enough yet to do that. And the government's deciding to reopen the schools and cover themselves on that by claiming that it's been the vaccine that's had the effect. And it's clear from the scientific evidence and the comments from the scientists that that's not the case. Yet again, we're seeing the government recklessly do something which is going to kill people. And the media and even the Labour Party, tragically, are largely giving them cover. Keir Starmer's been as keen or keener than Boris Johnson to get schools reopened. And, has fought the unions on various things to try to make it safe if they do. It's a sorry situation on that. And, when you've got the British Medical Journal calling the government, social murderers for the way that they're behaving, then you know that the situation is very grim.
The narrative that's being worked up is really concerning as well. As you pointed out, Steve, very few people have received both vaccinations. And actually, the majority of parents and staff working in schools will not have even had one dose of the vaccine yet. So the vaccinations won't actually be helping that many people who are going to be put at additional risk from the schools returning on Monday. I heard this morning they were saying that the infection rate's back down to where it was when we shut the schools down last January. Well, it's not better than that. We shut the schools down at this level. The schools were shut, for all but very few pupils a year ago for the virus. Our numbers are considerably higher than that. I can't see any argument for them to be going back on Monday. It's simply not safe. And all this talk about children having to catch up is adding to the mental health issues of the parents and the kids struggling that they're not performing or not able to do something that they ought to be able to do. Nobody set these are arbitrary levels of what children or people ought to be able to do. They're set by a narrative of a 19th century education system that's not fit for purpose as it currently stands. We need to really step back and have a little look here, because there's also worries that if people have had one vaccine or even two vaccines, there's concern that people will stop wearing face masks and so on, which will mean that the numbers will go right back up. You still have to be careful when you've had one or even two doses of the vaccine, because you could still transmit the virus.
And we've had the absolutely massive situation, and quite a kind of crazy situation, to be honest, where, you know, the government has been expending considerable time and effort this week trying to track down one person who's got this so-called Brazilian version of the virus, because it may well be an issue and a problem that we want to try to stamp out. But they're allowing the virus to then start running rampant around the country again by removing the lockdown restrictions, which creates the perfect situation for a new, we've had a Kent virus, will we end up with a Birmingham version or a whatever, that's going to, no disrespect to the people of Birmingham, love the city, but, a version popping up somewhere else purely because of the number of people that are being allowed to be infected. And, that every infection gives the virus another opportunity to mutate. So they're going crazy on one thing because it looks good on the news for the PR, but then, putting in a whole raft of changes and policies that are designed to give the virus a chance to turn into something else more dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, the BMJ calling it social murder when the Conservatives are proposing doing this, and the Labour Party jumping on board with it, making themselves accessories to social murder. It's all a big play to the media, isn't it? The media has been driving this narrative as a collective, rubbing shoulders with each other, pushing forward similar headlines about schools must go back, our children are suffering. Children suffer a lot more when they take this virus home, and it ends up making granny and granddad rather poorly or worse. Schools were the biggest vectors of transmission. We know this. The scientists said this all before. And the Conservatives love to say that, we're following the science, we're following the science. Well, the same scientists are saying, don't open them yet, because we don't know whether, it's the lockdown that is the most effective factor in getting these figures down at the moment. It's not the vaccination. And of course, we had Dr. Kailash Chand, our fellow host on Socialist Telly. Kailash came on the other day and he was saying, we have no idea what effect on transmission vaccination after one dose or even two doses is going to have. What we do know is that these vaccines were designed to work over two doses, and most people do not have, if they've had one dose, they're fortunate. I still don't think they're in the minority of adults in this country if they've had one dose, let alone two. So there's very little to back up opening schools already. And again, they're making the same mistake, as they did the previous three times. Why are you opening the schools first? If they are the single biggest areas of transmission, why are they the first things to reopen? Surely common sense dictates they should be the last, but it just doesn't seem to be the way this government thinks.
I'm really, really pleased that they've said that children, or secondary age children, have to wear face masks in school at last. But I really also think that those face coverings ought to be provided by the school, because there's no guarantee that whatever kids put over their face will actually prevent transmission. And there'll be an awful lot of families as well that just don't have the cash to go and spend however much it costs for 10 face masks a week for their kids. There needs to be an equal provision that every child puts on the same kind of mask at the door of the school and have access to hand sanitizer at regular points too.
Yeah, that funding has to go into schools to be able to provide it, however, and there was absolutely nothing for education in the latest budget, was there?
Absolutely.
So, the government's going to have to put more money into the schools to be able to provide that. I agree with your point entirely. It should be so that, the PPE on offer and the sanitizer on offer is of the right formula, is of the right, what's the word, classification? That'll do. To prevent the spread of this virus around the schools, to make the mask wearing effective, essentially. And the only way they can do that is if it's led by the NHS and it's administered directly by the schools. But cloth masks it'll be from Granny, who's made a nice one with flowers on it, or cars or whatever. I think some people make some wonderful masks. They are beautiful, but are they effective? That's the question. And sanitizers come in all kinds of strengths. I think it's supposed to be more than 70% alcohol is effective, and not all of them are. So it would be prudent to have the schools put in these in effect, but they need the funding to do it.
They need the funding and they need the space to allow kids to socially distance a little bit as well. I mean, if anyone's gone past school gates at 3 o'clock or 3:30 in the last few weeks, you'll see lines of parents stood a metre or two apart from each other, some of whom have got masks on, and yet the kids that they're collecting will have been sat in the same room as 30 other kids and probably 3 adult members of staff, breathing all over each other. Unless those parents are wearing those face masks 24/7, that virus is getting into their homes.
I'll just take a second to point out before we move on to the next bit that the eagle-eyed will have spotted that we're running a captioning service on this now. We are experimenting on this because we are aware that there are people watching the program who may have hearing difficulties, and we don't want to leave anybody out. The captioning on here doesn't look as though it's any worse than you'll typically get on subtitles on the BBC or something like that when it's running live with the program. But we will continue to work on that and try and improve it and fine tune it as we go forward. So this is our first attempt, and I hope people are finding it helpful. On that pandemic issue, one of the things that came out in the budget this week was the fact that the test and trace system, as they call it, which doesn't do much testing and doesn't do much tracing, has received a funding boost from not 22 billion, which was already insane against the whole overall NHS budget, for example, but 37 billion pounds on a system which, it's come out this week, has managed to notify 276 venues, I think the number was, that they have had infected people in their premises and should therefore watch out. And that works out, if I did the maths correctly, around £131 million per venue that's been warned. And that's assuming that you only take the food venues, so restaurants and fast food outlets. Doesn't count pubs and other, cafes and other kind of hospitality venues, which would actually push the tiny percentage. It's well less than a 100%, I think it is, of venues being notified for the grand sum of £37 billion. And that is, again, it's, I want to say money down the drain, but it's not even down the drain. It's money directly into the bank accounts of people who are not performing a service for the money that they're getting. And the government claims that it's all about effectiveness and value for money. And yet we've seen, just this farce of exorbitant costs for things that don't work. And we've seen countries that do perfectly bog standard things, use the Apple or Google or whatever version of the Test and Trace app, for example, and can have that for free and are getting a much better performance from it. We're throwing around a fifth of the NHS budget down the drain, even on the enlarged NHS budget, or directly into the bank accounts of Tory donors largely, for nothing. And the media, and it has to be said again, the Labour Party, are not hammering the government for the level of absolute, cronyism doesn't cover it, absolute corruption of the government and the way that it's behaving.
I mean, standard consumer law would say if you buy something that's not fit for purpose, you're entitled to have your money back. And I think it's about time we started asking for £37 billion of our money back, and then maybe we'd be able to afford a decent pay rise or an actual pay rise for all of our nurses working in our NHS.
Yeah, I think the test and trace system is well known as the biggest, well, it was got to be one of the biggest financial failures of government ever. It simply doesn't work. And £37 billion is absolutely eye-watering. They have just printed money and handed it out to predominantly Tory donors. You know, it's the wife of a Tory MP, the anti-corruption champion of the government, oddly enough. And it is absolutely corrupt. So anybody saying, "Oh well, we can't afford this. We got to live within our means," the government's got to make sure that we stay within the black. If you thought there wasn't a magic money tree before, they've rattled it to within an inch of its life to provide for test and trace. I think when people talk about exorbitant sums like 22 billion as it was before, or 37 billion now, it's very hard to visualize exactly what sum of money this is. So I just wanted to make an illustrative example of, £1 billion. If you had it in nice crisp £20 notes and you stacked them all one on top of each other, you would have a stack of £20 notes 3.5 miles high. That's £1 billion. £37 billion. I wonder if anybody, wherever you are living in the country, if you just think about where somewhere about 130 miles away from you would be. Can you imagine £20 notes stacked from your feet all the way to 130 miles away? That's what, London to Brighton, perhaps? That's £37 billion. London to Brighton in 20s. I mean, if you thought,
it'll probably be London to Brighton and back again.
And back again, possibly. I mean,
yeah, as it happens, it's almost exactly the distance from Liverpool, where I live now, to Middlesbrough, where I used to live in the northeast. So you could cross the Pennines with all that, and then go all the way up through North Yorkshire, and just arrive nicely in Liverpool on that stack of £20 notes. It's insane.
It's roughly from where I live to Jacob Rees-Mogg's constituency in Somerset.
If ever there was an example that outsourcing in the NHS or in any of our public services is a really bad idea, this is it. Surely, in the wake of this happening, the Labour Party ought to be standing up and saying, we're going to strip all these private contracts out and we're going to return everything to being in-source. Because if the government invested £37 billion on insourcing NHS services to the NHS, stripping out all of those layers of payments to stockholders and so on, we would have our NHS back to where it was in the 70s.
I think that's a fantastic point you make, actually. Outsourcing, regardless of who it is outsourced to, that means some of the money being invested in it, quite a lot of it quite often, goes into a shareholder's pocket and does absolutely nothing to deliver the service they're being paid for. The NHS was created so that, our health services were met, and all monies that was made from those services was sunk back into improving the service itself. Nobody made any money out of it. It was all to keep that service running, to keep it improving, to keep it growing and developing, to meet the needs of the population of this country as the population grows, as we meet more obstacles in the way of our health, such as this COVID crisis. It was designed to meet all of those. 10 years, or more than 10 years now, of the Conservatives cutting it up, outsourcing sections of it, has cost us more and more as taxpayers and delivered a service that is struggling to meet the most basic needs, and certainly couldn't cope with this COVID crisis. And a test and trace system that was developed by the NHS would have been one that would have worked. You can see it would have worked if you only have to look at the vaccination system that is being administered across the country, because the NHS has delivered the vaccinations. And that has worked. And we've had millions and millions of people now have had the vaccinations. They've only had one. They need more time. And again, it comes back to, are we unlocking too early again? The evidence seems to point out that we very much are.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to, tragically, we still have more to talk about in terms of the conduct of the Labour Party. I mean, it's bad enough, the lack of opposition at a national level, but around the country we're seeing some appalling behaviour by Labour And, whether you paint it as incompetence or you paint it as stitch-ups, it's dire and a gross insult, not just to members in a particular city, but those cities themselves. Liverpool. Bonnie, what do you know about what's going on there?
Well, we're seeing, again, the stripping out of local democracy by the top of the party, either by regional offices or by HQ. And we really do have to start seeing members being trusted to vote with what they think is the right thing to do, rather than somebody impose what's the right thing from above. Certain functions of selections of candidates have to be undertaken by a centralised body, such as due diligence, checking who they are, finding out if they're genuinely of the party they're seeking to represent. But beyond that, once you have all of those hurdles covered, beyond that, it really has to be an open choice for the people that get to have a vote in it. I mean, I'm a bit reluctant to talk too much about Liverpool because I don't live there. But as an outside observer, I can see that people's voices have been completely swept to one side so that somebody in a position can hopefully get a different result to the one that they were expecting to achieve.
Demo, I'll let you go next. I'll go last, seeing as I actually live here.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've sort of like thrown us under a bus here, really. You're the one that lives in Liverpool. But yes, obviously, here on Socialist Alley, we've been covering this story in Liverpool extensively. 3 candidates who were selected to stand for Labour to go forward to stand for the city mayor. They were selected, and all of a sudden they were not selected anymore, and they were taken out, removed from the list, including Anna Rothery, who we've spoken to here and had by and large been supporting on our channel. They still don't know, and all 3 of them, they don't know why they've been removed to this day. They still don't know. But 2 more candidates have been brought in. One young chap who's about 25 years of age to run the city mayor, and he's found it difficult to even send out emails properly, I believe, calling people by surname, which is rather gentlemanly, isn't it? And of course, there's another person who has got allegations of bankruptcies against their name, which smacks of a complete failure of due diligence, if true, on the part of the Labour Party. I mean, what is going on there? It's rank incompetence, and it smells of a stitch-up. But you've written in detail about this week, Steve, so I dare say you can fill in the blanks better than we can.
Yes, I mean, the issues are almost too numerous to count. It started off with the imposition of a new shortlist by the party, where we had a shortlist of 3 women, one of who would have been the UK's first black mayor if selected and then elected, black female mayor, as an elected mayor. And, suddenly that's replaced with the shortlist of one quite young man who hasn't had a great deal of council experience and one woman with even less council experience, who, as it seems to have emerged this morning, according to the excellent Zello Street site, has 2 bankruptcies in her history. Now, anybody can get into financial problems and wouldn't hold that against anyone. And somebody who's been in that position might be a fantastic politician. And it's not a personal kind of aspersion on her in that sense. However, it's a political gift to other parties and to the media to be able to drag out, as Tim from Zeller Street pointed out, drag out every kind of disparaging stereotype of Scousers, Liverpool people, and use that to hammer Labour. And it's just a massive failure of due diligence, really, at that point. That something which is there as an official record hasn't been checked by the party before they put, if you're going to give people a shortlist of 5 and one of them has, some issues in their past and the members can decide whether they care about that or not, that's fine. But to give people a choice between, somebody with very little experience, somebody with even less experience and some issues against them, and that's the total sum of the choice, is just appalling management of selection by the party, leaving aside even the scandalous way that they canned the previous shortlist of 3 councillors with, I think it was half a century of senior council experience among them, two former cabinet members, and one current Lord Mayor of the city. Absolutely appalling, and that's been widely attacked. And as far as the black candidate is concerned, that's appalled black people and black groups around the whole country in terms of the way that Labour seems to be pouring contempt on their chance to have some representation. And it brings shame on the party, and it doesn't reflect. It brings shame on a city that doesn't deserve to have that shame reflected on it, because we haven't chosen that. There's a small bunch of people, probably not many of whom are from Liverpool, have made that choice and made that decision and just imposed it on everybody else. And that has been condemned. I mean, that's there has been an open letter this week which has been signed by several MPs from Liverpool, black and BAME MPs from around the country, similar with councillors, union organisations, union branches in the area, black and ethnic minority representation groups around the country have all come out and said, this is a scandal. Labour, get your act together and reinstate the people that you've scrapped. And so far the party's just turning a deaf ear to that and allowing something to rumble on, which they really didn't ever need to inflict on us and them in the first place.
Yeah, as much as it seems like a regional issue, it touches everybody nationally. I think if you think about it, if you're in the Labour Party, such as we are, and you live in a certain area, you want your best possible candidates to be standing to represent you. And you've got three ladies who, between them, have about 50 years of council experience, to have been removed from the slate, taken away from the people of Liverpool as options to choose, and replaced by two individuals with barely a handful of years of experience as councillors, both backbench councillors at that. They've got no front bench or cabinet experience whatsoever. You can smell the stitch up a mile off. How on earth can you justify removing people with that level of experience to replace them with people with virtually no experience?
One of whom didn't even want to be a councillor after May as well. It should be remembered, mate.
Yeah, she was going to
one was stepping down. It didn't like being a councillor by the looks of it, and yet suddenly they're on the mayoral shortlist.
We're supposed to be a socially democratic party, and yet, having taken all of those three shortlisted candidates out, we've been offered absolutely no reason for that happening. And what we've also seen is the arbitrary dismissal of selection that ought to have been an all-women shortlist place. It was an all-women shortlist place. I mean, regardless of your views on AWSs, if it was agreed that it needed to be an AWS for Liverpool, why is it not an AWS any longer?
Yes, well, I don't think it was ever formally an all-women shortlist. It was this fact that the three best candidates, as the party considered it at the time, were all women, and and that's fantastic. But then the party's just throwing that in the bin. It seems like issues like equality and gender balance and all the other things are great for Labour when it suits them and they can get the candidates in that they want, and when they can't, then they're quite happy to scrap all that and act in a completely hypocritical fashion. I think the reason as well that people around the country should care about this, because it's happening up in Liverpool. Some people watching this might never have been to the city, but what happens in one place, if the party gets away with it there, will soon happen in another. And we've seen a similar situation to that just in the last day or day and a half, where not very long ago we saw in Bristol, Bristol members railroaded out of their own annual general meeting by the regional office taking over, running it in an absolutely appalling way and disenfranchising a huge tranche of the membership. And then this week we've seen the Streatham constituency Labour Party find that, again, without any adequate reason being given, and in fact with the reasons being given why the regional office shouldn't do that, region took over the meeting, made an absolute horror of it, barred a lot of people from entering the meeting or failed to admit them, let's put it charitably, a lot of whom happened to be black. Again, that issue, rearing its head. And, and then, as I understand it, the party trying to declare winners from the Labour right slate in the votes in the meeting, when a large number of the members hadn't been allowed to cast a vote in the first place. Now they do seem to be, fiddling around the edges of putting that right by sending ballots out to people. But even when they've done that, some of the key positions that the people are supposed to be voting on haven't been included on the ballot papers that they've received. So, if it happens in Bristol, then it goes to Streatham. Next time it'll be, in Stoke or somewhere. If they get away with this stuff, then they'll do it again and again and again. And we've seen that emerge as a real pattern. And again, it seems we've had the free speech issue, we've had the solidarity issues with Jeremy Corbyn, we've had all the other stuff going on. That the party is just seems to have launched this assault on free speech, and now they're getting down into the nitty gritty of people's individual meetings where they vote on who they want to run that CLP, as it's known, for the rest of the year. And at the same time, they're using the excuse, again, according to even members of the NEC who are not particularly on the left. They use it, the National Executive Committee, that is. They're using the inability to hold an annual general meeting of some CLPs because of the pandemic as a reason to say that they can't send delegates to the conference. So given that conferences where all of the rule changes are decided, where the appointment of the General Secretary will either be confirmed or rejected, etc., you've got to wonder what they're trying to, what they're planning to push through at the conference if it happens later this year. That they don't think they can get through if members are allowed to represent themselves adequately at the meeting.
Yeah, it's a pattern, like you say. It's almost a carbon copy situation of what happened in Bristol West, where the local regional office decided to come in and say, we're going to run it, and they run it into the floor. And this is exactly what's happened here. It does make you wonder how on earth these people who work at regional office end up in the position they're in, because they're either grossly incompetent or they're absolutely useless at what they're actually supposed to do. You've got a situation there where members have been barred from voting again. You've got a situation where a disproportionate number of people from an ethnic background have been refused to vote. And essentially the end result is a load of right-wingers get all the positions. This is the second time we've seen this sort of pattern happen now. It's Bristol, now it's Streatham. Like you say, Steve, it'll be somewhere else after that and somewhere else after that. And the knock-on effect is these are the people who then get to choose who goes forward to represent the party at conference. And you can, when you've got an acting general secretary such as David Evans, who still needs the ratification of conference to confirm him in his post, you kind of think this guy's really unpopular, but Keir quite likes him, so we need to get him confirmed somehow by hook or by crook. And crook very much seems to be the option they've chosen to take.
And it's not only that it will happen, it's already happening because, since the information's gone out on Streatham and Liverpool this week, I've had people from various parts of the country contacting me saying it's either already happened in their area or it's going on at the moment. So, it is a pattern. There doesn't seem to be any room for doubt that it's actual intentional conduct by the Labour Party.
Yeah, and the fact that it's not any particular region that's carrying out these anti-democratic attacks on our constituency Labour parties. We've got London region, we've got North West, we've got, is it Western region for Bristol? It seems like this is policy coming from above. But interestingly, all the time that they're attacking and cutting layers of democracy away from our membership and our constituency parties, we're seeing more and more constituencies now demanding a call that's been put out by a lot of trade unions and socialist groups for a recall conference. And I think there's going to be some movement on that in the next week. If your CLP hasn't had a look at the recall conference motion, please do consider getting it to your branch. If you've not been put into purdah because of local elections that are happening imminently, please do consider supporting that motion.
Now, as we round off the programme, let's, as we often try to do, finish on a positive. There have been a couple of very good developments this week, again, based on work by grassroots people and working class backbench MPs. The Fans Supporting Food Banks organisation, which has started in Merseyside and has spread around the country now and even into other countries, has been fantastic. Even when football matches haven't had live crowds, there have still been efforts going on where the fans are finding ways to contribute to the local food bank effort to feed people who otherwise would be really struggling to feed themselves. And one of the founding members of that fan supporting food banks group in Liverpool is local MP Ian Byrne, who still is a councillor in the area until the local elections coming up. And he and the fan supporting food banks group have been pushing very hard on a right to food campaign to actually make food a legal right in this country, which would then forbid the government from allowing people to go hungry, which is what they're currently doing. And that started in Liverpool. It was very quickly then taken up by Manchester. Then this week it's also been voted through in Rotherham Borough and in Haringey Borough, which is the first one in London to come on board with that and declare themselves a right to food council area. So, I mean, congratulations to everybody who's been involved with that effort. If your area hasn't voted it yet, push your local councillors and MPs to back that, because it's absolutely essential.
Hear, hear. It's a fantastic initiative that Fan Supporting Food Banks have started, and it's a fantastic MP, proper Labour socialist MP who is down there and connected with grassroots efforts that's driven this forward and highlighted it. And it's brilliant that the football clubs as well have embraced this. I mean, Liverpool and Everton, they don't normally known for being the best of friends, but they've both got on board with this completely and totally on the same page with this, and it's spreading from there. It is a indictment on this government that so many people are going hungry in this, the sixth richest economy on the planet, but it's simply because most people don't see just how wealthy this country is. You say, well, harken back to all those billions being sent on test and trace. It shows where this money's going, and it shows where this government's priorities are. And it isn't on the basics, such as making sure people have enough to eat or have a roof over their heads. Basic things that you expect a country as wealthy as ours to meet without any quibble whatsoever. But sadly, we're having to fight tooth and claw to get these things put across. And it's brilliant that Manchester has embraced it, that Haringey has embraced it, Rotherham, and I hope over the next week we can announce a few more places as well.
Fantastic. Bonnie, any last words before we round off for the week?
Well, yeah, all I would say is I'll repeat my plea. If people haven't put forward a motion for a recall of conference, please do try and get that through. It's really important that our members' voices are well and truly heard by the leadership of the party, by the General Secretary of the party, and also do at the same time put through a motion so that your town becomes a right to food area as well. So I mean, these are real positive things that we can do as members of our party to make a real difference in everybody's lives. It doesn't bear thinking about that we even have to put forward the idea that people have the right to food or the right to housing or the right to healthcare, but apparently we do. I mean, I saw I took part in the No Holding Back review or anticipation and notes on the budget. And there's almost a pound for pound transfer from people who have the least to the people that already have more money than they could spend in 100 lifetimes. We do need to be pushing for some more equality. And anyone who didn't see those shows, please look out for them. They're obviously on the socialist telly channels and everything. So do have a look at those programs, because some very interesting facts came out from them.
Very good. And I will just give one quick plug on the issue of hospital closures. If you, well, whether you're on Twitter or not, go to twitter.com/Tory Fibs and have a look, because that account is running a survey of people around the country to be able to put in information on what closures, reductions, mergers, whatever else are happening in their local area in terms of hospitals and accident emergency in particular. So if you know of something that's happened in your area, get yourself there, go through to the Google document, which is available for editing, and you can chip in your details there and check what's going on in your local area if you're not already aware of it.
Yeah, on that, very quickly, Steve, if you are an activist fighting against the downgrading of a hospital, please drop us a line. If you want to come on to an NHS programme with me, you'd be very welcome. Let us know.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody who's watched us. We'll see you again next week when no doubt there'll be another paucity of information